G'day everybody, how you going today? It is so good to see you and I do hope you are super well. This is a very straightforward video where we are going to compare the brand new Nikon Z180 to 600 with the somewhat older Sony 200 to 600. Now both of them are 5.6 to 6.3 through the range. And even so that sounds rather similar, there are some differences. In this video we're going to go through the spec, and in my next video we're going to be out in the field testing out these lenses.
There we go, we're getting eye detect on the bird now that it's come towards me.
They certainly look really similar from the outside, the height, the shape, the button layout and so on. But the more you drill into it, the more you realise that they are not the same after all. And also in my follow-up video with these two lenses, we will be using the Megadap E to Z adapter to mount this on my Z9, Z8 or both. Why not? You'll get the same sort of result anyway. Alright, so let's talk about the specs. Something that came as a little bit of a surprise to me, that if you look at the USA pricing today of the Sony lens, it is $1,999, whereas the Nikon lens is $1,699. Now, that's a $300 difference between these lenses. Now, of course, it doesn't really matter particularly much if the technology is the same. If the more modern Nikon lens is just that little bit better and it's $300 cheaper, then you start to wonder what's going on here in Sony land. Let's dive into the spec. Well, of course, the very first spec that we can look at is focal length, and although it's not much, there is that fundamental difference, 200 to 600 versus 180 to 600. Does that 20mm change things? No, I don't think it's a big deal, but I suppose every millimetre that you can get wider is a millimetre that you can get wider. Now, the f-stops is another interesting one. On paper, they are both 5.6 to 6.3. They actually change their aperture ranges at different times. Whereas the Nikon goes from 5.6 to 6.0 to 6.3 as you go through the zooming range. The Sony goes from 5.6 directly to 6.3 with no 6.0 in the middle. And having a quick look at the lenses and exactly where they change, here are the numbers. Now, in reality, this is not a big deal, but I just want to stress that we can clearly see by the fact that these things are so different that indeed the lenses are not the same. So just to make sense of what you can see here with these numbers, the Nikon from 180 to 290 is 5.6, then from 300 to 480 it is aperture f6, and then 490 to 600 it is f6.3, whereas with the Sony from 200 to 300mm it's 5.6, and then from 310 all the way to 600 it just jumps straight to f6.3. And for some reason, there's no f6.0 in the middle. Not sure why, but that is how it is. Now again, this is not a big deal, but it certainly says to me, even so these lenses look very similar on the outside, already with the first two top line specs, they are behaving differently. And they are different. The minimum focus distance, it states here on the Sony, is 2.4 meters or 7.87 feet. The minimum focus distance on the Nikon is also 2.4 meters at 600 mils. But there's more to come here. We will look through more of the focal range, the zoom range, in the coming video. The maximum magnification is 0.2 times on the Sony, and it is 0.25 times on the Nikon. Now, let's talk about groups and elements. In the optical design, the Sony has 24 elements across 17 groups, whereas the Nikon has 25 elements, so one extra element in there across 17 groups. Now, this is an interesting one to me. The Sony has 11 aperture blades, the Nikon has 9 aperture blades. They both have a removable and rotating collar. They both have a filter size of 95 mils. And the length of the lenses is so very close, with the Sony being 318 millimeters and the Nikon coming in 2 millimeters shorter at 315.5 millimeters, or around 12.4 inches. Weight-wise, the Nikon Z comes in lighter at 1,955 grams, whereas the Sony is 2,115 grams, both minus the tripod collar. And let's take a moment to talk about the switching gear. Yes, the Sony lens does have a few more switches on it, and they are related to stabilization. One of these switches here is turning stabilization on and off, and the other switch here is giving you 3 types of stabilization. On the Nikon are moving VR functionality into the graphical user interface. And thus, on most of their VR lenses, we do not have external VR switches anymore. Otherwise, the 2 other switches that are remaining, they are for the same purpose. They are for control over focus, whether it's auto or manual, and they are for control over distance limiting, where the Sony actually gives you 3 positions: full, the minimum, and then they're actually giving you in the middle a range in the middle of 10 meters to 2.4 meters. Who knows how often these switches are used? And I've often thought, when it comes to Apple, when they decide to remove the headphone jack, or they might decide to start removing other ports, they removed floppy drives, they removed optical drives from their computers and phones and so on. My belief is that ultimately what happens is they test the market. They try and get data from the market. How many people are using these switches? How often do they use it? Are they just left on all the time? And so on. And then the decisions are made to keep or remove simply based on the majority of use cases. And if I was to hazard a guess at the tolerance that it might take for a switch to be removed, it might be that, let's say, 90% of people really don't use those switches anymore. And at that sort of point, that number, that overwhelming number of something like 90%, I think would then precipitate the removal of a switch. I think if it was something like 50-50 and 50% of people were still using the switch and 50% weren't, I don't think they would be removing it. Now, an interesting difference here, both of these tripod collars are removable. In the case of the Sony, you actually have the option of removing this foot, and this just makes packing in your bag simpler, and I suppose if you don't want the weight on any given day, again, it's not a massive difference, and you can replace either of these collars and get something that, for example, is Arca Swiss, like this one has been updated to. As we can see with the lens element breakdown diagram, when it comes to the interior of these lenses, they are actually different when it comes to the positioning of the glass, the number of elements that are in the lens, and even the number of aperture blades that are used in these 2 different versions. And here are the MTF charts for your perusal, Sony on the left and Nikon on the right. Also, both of these lenses do take teleconverters. Quite frankly, they look really similar, but they're not. And in the next video, we will test out the performance. My guess is, and I've had a little bit of a native play with these lenses on their respective cameras on the Sony and on the Nikon, and quite frankly, they seem to behave very, very similarly. Perhaps there's micro differences in autofocus, but we will find out in the next video. Thank you so much for being here today. As always, I'd love your thoughts. At the end of the day, our collective thoughts are more important than my thoughts, that's for sure. So I'd love to hear all of your thoughts and more in the comments below. It's been so good to see you, and if this is your first time here, I would love to see you again. So please do subscribe, please share, and please like. Bye for now.